Hi, my name is Bart.
My name is Lewis. We are two pilots with a passion for history.
Welcome to our channel, High on History.
Hello everyone, welcome to High on History. This is where Bart and I discover a city that we love.
Yes, Lewis. Well, let's have a look behind us. It's a river, and it ain't that big. It's not really La Seine in Paris, neither is it the Thames in London.
Exactly, so given its size, I won't expect much out of it.
Unless history decided otherwise.
Let's take a look.
Somebody I can miss. I want something just like this. I want something just like this. Oh, I want something just like this.
Our first episode, so where does history start? Well, that's very easy, with the coming of the Romans to the Brussels capital region. That's why we are here in Jette, at the oldest stone remains in the whole of the Brussels capital region. This used to be an old Roman villa.
Exactly, and we've been so lucky enough to be in contact with two experts in the field, and we're going to interview them and ask some questions about the Romans, how they lived, what they talked, and yeah, I hope you enjoy it.
Enjoy, guys. Could you please be so kind to say your name and introduce yourself?
I will. My name is Eugène Warmenbol. I am a teacher professor at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, and I teach the recent prehistory of Northwestern Europe.
And Serge, would you please be so kind to introduce yourself as well?
And I'm Serge de Fesraat, proudly ex-student of Eugène at the university, vice president of the Belgian Society of Celtic Studies.
So guys, it's the first question we had, and I think this is particularly for Serge and Eugène. If you want to add something, feel free. Before the Romans arrived in this area, what should we imagine the area of Brussels was like?
Okay, if we go to the very, very old, the first thing that you would see in Brussels is not actually from Brussels itself. Here we would be under the sea, and the whole Brabant would be under the sea. What you see on the streets of Brussels is the Belgian blue stone that you can find from Tournai till the Ardennes.
Okay.
And all of you have noticed this kind of thing on the ground or on bridges and everything. Actually, it looks like a bee's nest. It's not, it's a coral called Michelinia favosa, and it's 350 million year old from the Tournaisien period, from the primary era. So this is something interesting because everybody walks on it, sees it, but they don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But it's not Brussels, it's just nearby. The first thing you would be in Brussels, what would happen here, you would be eaten by a shark. Because we're in the sea again, but this is more recent. It's 45 million year old, and it's a period which is called internationally as Bruxellien.
Okay.
And actually, this is found in Brussels a little bit everywhere. It's forêt, and you see small, high tandem shark teeth. So this is literally Brussels. If you see the oldest thing that is in Brussels itself,
So
that
this
would
was
be
found
this.
in the area of Brussels?
In any sand place. Now, if we go again much more recent, we don't know whether humans are here or not. Actually, they should, but we don't have tracks. But in the Pleistocene, say around 100,000 years ago, you would find in Brussels, in Ixelles, for instance, you have tracks of bison and so on. And along the Boulevard Anspach, under the South Railway Station, remains of mammoth.
Okay.
So wherever those animals were this period, human should be, but we have nothing. The first human recognized settlement is more Eugène's specialty.
Yeah. Well, actually, the first settlement we know of in Brussels is in Boisfort, and is actually quite well preserved. It's a fortified site, which was built by people from what they call the Mikkelsberg culture. This is the Middle Neolithic, meaning something like in between 4,500 and 4,000 BC. These are agricultures. They also have cattle. It means that we are in Belgium since 5,000 BC, dealing with a sedentarian population. Now, Boisfort is the only trace of these people in Brussels itself, but we have other settlements nearby. It's very difficult to say, as for any prehistoric period, how dense the population was then, but they clearly didn't stay home all the time, because there are other finds of the same period that are scattered all over Brussels. One of them is one of the oldest finds we still have, made in Brussels, 1784. Somebody picked up a magnificent greenstone axe. It's in Jade, actually. We know now that this Jade comes from the Italian Alps, so it comes from far away. There is some kind of international exchange already in the 5th millennium before Christ. This subject is a trace of it. It was found in Diegem. After that, things become more obscure. We are jumping from one period to another, as you realize, and one has to wait until the very end of the Iron Age to have again something that can be called a settlement. So I'm not talking about loose finds. These are always problematic. Everybody picks up things in the 19th century, everybody everywhere. There's so much building going on in Brussels, so of course people are excavating things, but without any control and without knowing what they're doing, actually. Yeah. But we do have settlements for, let's say, the last century before Christ, and that's the period where here in Brussels we have the Nervii. The Nervii are one of the tribes mentioned by Julius Caesar. They're very important. We know the name of one of their kings, Boduognat. He had a statue in Antwerp, but never in Brussels. And the Nervii were clearly among the most fierce opponents of Caesar. Now, there's no trace of their military activity whatsoever in the Brussels area. If you go a little out of Brussels, you do have traces in Asse, for instance. I think I will leave Serge to talk about Asse, but first about Brussels. Brussels, you have a settlement in Uccle, in the Neckersgat, and then you have a settlement in Anderlecht, Chapelle Sainte-Anne. There's not much left, but archaeologists usually do a lot with very little. So we have some fragments of pottery, we have some objects, one rather spectacular one, which is probably a chain to hang up a pot in Haag. But nothing much, but enough to know that there must have been several settlements in the general area of Brussels then. The Romans arrive, Romanization starts all over Gallia Belgica. So Gallia Belgica gave its name to Belgium, but it's much bigger than what Belgium is now, meaning Gallia Belgica is an area that is defined by Caesar between the Rhine and the Seine, so it's a lot bigger than Belgium now. But Romanization gets underway, and for the 2nd and the 3rd century, again, we have several settlements, but the name settlement is maybe not completely appropriate. Several settlements, which are then villas, which means, in fact, big farms.
Like the one we have
and we
here.
sit in the middle of one of them.
Exactly.
In Jette, and you have also another one in Anderlecht, Chapelle Saint-Étienne. But this one is the one that has been excavated most recently, and so it's the best documented. Unfortunately, fortunately, archaeology is a science that is evolving quite quickly. And what was done in the 19th century, I hope nobody would ever do that again in the 21st century. So a lot of the older excavations are not very well documented.
Eugène, another question we had is, how do these people live? And you mentioned the spots, so they lived in huts, or?
Well, the main thing to
know
is that they are busy with agriculture and with animal husbandry. So they're farmers, fundamentally.
What kind of animals are we talking about? Do you know?
The classical ones we still have. Cows, pigs. Mostly they had dogs, just to keep the cattle nearby, or maybe to warn them if there was something happening in the night. I don't know. But the landscape is quite open, actually. I was talking earlier about this fortified settlement, indeed, with a wall, which is still visible. for the 4000 BC, years before 4000 BC. But by the first century, well, there's still some of these fortified settlements indeed, but a part of that, people are living in the open.
Okay, all scattered
And not in villages. They're very, very much scattered. Now you have to imagine a place like this. Take some imagination, like one of these big farms you have in Brabant and in the Hainaut, with not only a main building, which was probably the place where the landowner lived.
Yeah.
You can imagine it with some luxury. Yes, the best preserved ones we have in Belgium do have floor heating. They have baths. They're decorated with paintings.
Quite
They're quite
advanced,
luxurious things, in fact.
Yeah.
But these villas are rather isolated, in fact. Now, it doesn't mean that there are no settlements at all. There are along the roads. And then you have a few cities, indeed. But there are not many. And there was apparently none underneath Brussels.
Okay.
There are a few villas, indeed. That is a classical landscape in the Roman period. But Brussels, as far as we know, was certainly not an important city, like Tongeren was or like Tournai has been.
And all along this axis, you would find, we don't have villas and at all, but we find bits of tegulae, which are the tiles. So this is a little bit of it, but this is the most common thing that you would find in Brussels from the Roman time, a little bit everywhere, but especially along this axis from the Dieweck till the Romance away. So it's a tile, actually, it should be big like this. Okay. This one is not from Brussels, it comes from Rowley near Charleroi. It should be like this, it's flat, and they go like here and here all along.
Yeah. Okay.
And so that's relatively frequent, not more, because they've been destroyed by the time and by Middle Age and then everything that was after.
And who destroyed, because I read somewhere that during the Romans, obviously they settled this place, as you both know, but this abruptly ended. Maybe can you talk about this?
Not that abruptly, actually. That is a kind of image that is often given by, in a less scientific approach. Everything happens on what a French historian called la longue durée. So everything takes some time, and there's little that is so abrupt as some history books show it. For instance, the Roman conquest. Yes, we have those texts by Caesar. We see that in 7 years he seems to have conquered the whole of Gaul,
genocide,
which is said on the title page of Asterix and Obelix also. He conquered all Gaul. Yeah. Not really. He was the first, indeed, to bring the Roman army with dire consequences for our area. But the actual Romanization took at least half a century. Wow. The first clear traces of Roman way of living is not before the Emperor Augustus. Augustus, meaning for our area, by something like 1510 BC. Yeah. Augustus is emperor since 31, but not before 1510 BC. So it takes half a century. And the same with the end of the Roman Empire. Yes, you have dates, of course, 476, the end of the Western Roman Empire. But this, again, is not something that happens from one day to another. We are dealing with a period in the history of man, I would say, where things were not as hectic as today.
Okay, I see. And I think this leads into another nice question we had as well. We talked about the Franks, we talked about the Romans, we talked about the Gauls. The question we had is, we Belgians, where do we originate from? Are we Celtic, are we Gaul, or are we maybe a mix of different people?
This is actually not a difficult one. We are a real mix of many things and many people. Yes, there is Celtic blood in us, probably. There is Roman blood in us. There is a lot more of that in us. And yes, these catching phrases like nos ancêtres les Gaulois, which was introduced by Napoleon III in France to put all the French behind one ancestor. Well, these are constructions that are for Europe 19th century and are driven by nationalism. but that kind of construction you still find today.
So in conclusion, the people around Brussels and people in Belgium are a mix of different
Exactly.
tribes.
Clearly, German language is the Franks, not before. I mean, here, as far as those Gaulish tribes, okay, there is a controversy. Because indeed Caesar says they're German, then sometimes he says they're Gaulish, and so you don't know very well. No, the names are Gaulish, typically. Ambiorix is king of both sides in Gaulish. Bodognathos can mean two things. Actually, it's born from the crow,
Okay.
or for the victory, born for the victory. The other one of the Eburones is Katu Volkos. It's also very typically Gaulish.
So we've heard that there wasn't really a city or a big settlement in the Brussels area at the times of the Roman and before. So our question now to Serge and Eugène, of course, is was there anything mentioned about Brussels, or any mentioning of the name of Brussels, or anything related to that during those Roman times?
Actually, no, we find no name of Brussels, probably. At the time of the Gaulish, neither at the time of the Romans. But actually, Brussels is a countryside with some sparse settlement. There is something nearby, and the real Brussels, the real, even maybe origin of Brussels is actually Asse, which is 10 kilometers of Brussels in the Flemish Brabant. And Asse is an oppidum, rather big. It's a 42 hectares oppidum, Gaulish, Nervians, densely occupied probably, which remains occupied during the Roman time, even very densely. No, Brussels was nothing, and well, almost, and Asse was there like a big thing. And actually, what we could think about Brussels is that Asse does not have access to a navigable river at all. So if Brussels was anything, that would be the nearest point, whereas the boats could arrive from the North Sea would be Brussels. Actually, when we think of the origin of Brussels, we're talking of a small portus near the Isle Saint-Géry, and that was around the 10th, 11th century. We could think, but we have no proof about it, that if Asse wanted to have anything like this very important trade coming from England and everything, which was the rule, you were to work on rivers. Well, anything that would arrive to Asse would go through Brussels.
And
if there is something, but we have not trace of
And
that.
what river are you talking about?
Pardon?
What river are you mentioning here?
The Sena.
The Sena. Okay.
The Sena is actually navigable for small boats till Brussels, and then you have this island Saint-Géry, and that all is finished. That made me think of something, but that one is really hypothesis and very speculative.
Go for it.
That Brussels would maybe not be this Bruxelles, which would be a manor on the Muras. But I was thinking, yeah, okay, Brussels would be the first bridge and the first elevation that you would see if you were along the Sena. And so I thought of Briva Uxella, which is a bridge near the hills.
Okay.
There is Uccle, which comes from a name which is together German and Gaulish, Okelo in Gaulish and Okil in German, which means the hill. Well, that is very clear, there is a hill there. No more striking, but again problematic, is Ixelles. Alors, officially, the origin of Ixelles is an old L-cell. In the 13th century, you find Ixelles already. Now, all over the world, you would have an Ixelles, you think of the Gaulish Uxellos, which means the high place. Again, it's a high. It's an adjective meaning high. So Andero Yalo, low place, Uxello Yalo, high place, sounds nice, but not proven, and not provable. It will never be proven.
There's something in archaeology that could contribute to the discussion about the Brussels in the Roman period. We're talking about villas, and villas spread all over Brussels. There's one on a high place in Uccle. But more recently there was an excavation near the Tourmentaxis area, and what was found there is something like a small port, indeed.
Okay.
So there's not enough found to be really sure about the role of the site, but it was said that if Brussels had some kind of existence in the Roman period, besides this countryside villas, well, maybe it's to be found in the area of Tourmetaxis, and maybe we would have there the site, indeed, that was connected to Asse. From the Seine, you get into the Deile. From the Deile, you get into the Scheldt. This is, of course, since always a very important axis. The pre-Roman period is very, very dependent on these fluvial accesses, and still in the Roman period they are very, very important.
But why Briva? Why did they think of a bridge? Just because if indeed the navigation can come up the Seine till Brussels, the first place where you would find a bridge would be Brussels, because after that you can build bridge where you want without being a problem for the navigation. Okay. For the Romans, being a high bridge with navigation is not a problem. For the Gaulish, it was a problem. So they would not put bridges everywhere, because that would impede the navigation
Of the boats. Okay.
So that's why I was thinking, okay, the first bridge that you would see, if you come along the Seine, you see elevations, and the first bridge, Briva-Auxerre. Again, hypothesis.
A hypothesis. But it could be reality. Anyway, about history, nobody really knows what the answer is. So we're just trying to find out with experts where more or less Brussels comes from.
Mare Nostrum, in Latin meaning RC, is a good representation of the vast Roman Empire. However, by the year 285, the Roman Empire had grown so big that it had become impossible for Rome to govern it just by itself.
So Emperor Diocletian made a decision. He divided the Roman Empire in the eastern and the western part, making his co-officer Maximilian co-emperor. The eastern part would have his capital in Byzantium. That's today's Istanbul. The western part would be governed from Milan, with the ceremonial capital remaining at Rome. The eastern part would differentiate itself. It would have Greek instead of Latin as its official language, and would also lose much of its original Roman character. The eastern part would flourish, mainly due to trade.
However, the western part would come into decline, and eventually, due to a mix of political instability, the invasion of the barbarians, and the rise of Christianity, collapse.
The eternal city of Rome fell in the year 410 to the Visigoths. This would be the first time in almost 800 years that Rome would be invaded by a foreign enemy. Rome fell, and soon later, in the year 476, the last Western Roman Empire, Augustulus, fell also to Germanic king Odoacer, ending the Western Roman Empire for good.
Exactly, Bart. So now, as you can see, there is a power vacuum. Or as a famous proverb says, one man's death is another man's breath. However, we want to know what happened here locally in Brussels. That's why we're here at the Parc des Cinquantenaires. We're going to talk to a conservator at the Museum of Art and History. Enjoy.
Thank you, Brit Class, for being on High on History. Could you please introduce yourself and let the audience know where we are?
Today we are in the Art and History Museum, Brussels. I am curator of the early medieval archaeology collection, and in the museum we have one exhibition hall dedicated to this period.
We had an interview with Professor Warmenbol from the ULB University, and we ended at the end of the Roman and Western Empire, the collapse, and we wondered what kind of impact did this have on the local area in Brussels.
Well, of course, the end of the Western Roman Empire is a well-known date, 476, but actually a lot of happened already before this date. We know from written sources that from the end of the 3rd century, Germanic groups first crossed the Rhine and come into the Roman Empire, which started causing some problems inside the Western Roman Empire, and this continued on in the 4th century and also in the 5th century, when then, well, finally in 476 will be the date that the Western Roman Empire will come to an end. But this process really goes gradually, and more German groups will establish themselves in our regions, and one of these groups for Belgium is very important are the Franks, and they will have the first Merovingian king, Childeric, so in the middle of the 5th century, that will take over power.
We know that the first Merovingian king was Childeric, but we wonder here for the people living in the Brussels capital region, what was really going on, how did they live and how did that impact their lives?
Well, for the Brussels capital region, we unfortunately have very little sources. In general, there are very few written sources for this period, but we know that even by the end of the Western Roman Empire, in the Brussels capital region, there were no episcopal seats. We are situated not so close to the Roman roads. So we don't really have a real center, administrative center here in the region, but that doesn't mean that there was nothing here in Brussels. As we know from Flanders, excavations in Flanders or northern France, it is very probable that here in the Brussels capital region there was dispersed rural occupation. That we know of indirectly in the 19th century in Anderlecht. There has been an excavation of an early medieval cemetery, and well, who says cemetery says of course also settlement, but unfortunately we have never found any traces of this early medieval settlement.
So you talked about the burial sites. There were not a lot of written sources. So these burial sites, were they Christian burial sites or did they have another religion, the Merovingians?
Well, what is certain is that this Merovingian period is very important for Christianity. For instance, Childeric's son, Clovis, he will be baptized around the end of the 5th century, and he will do this with many of his soldiers, and this is an act that would be very important for the future and the spread of Christianity. Even if during the Merovingian period we can say that locally it goes very gradually, this spread of Christianity, but when we arrive at the Carolingian period, so the next period, when the Carolingian dynasty takes over from the Merovingian dynasty in the middle of the 8th century, then we really see that Christianity is spread even among these local rural communities.
I've already told about all these Merovingian burial sites, but what is really unique is that for one specific grave in Tournai that was already found in the 17th century, we have the name of the person that was buried, and not just someone, as we can see here. We have his effigy and also his name written on the ring, Childerici Regis, and this person is no more than Clovis' father. And besides his name, we also have his image. We see his long hairs. He wears a spear. He still wears the Roman cloak closed with a fibula. And that is, of course, really extraordinary.
And the picture behind us, it's then depicting what exactly?
Well, actually, Childeric is the first king of this Merovingian dynasty, but he was not one of the most important figures of this dynasty. That will be his son Clovis, who will be baptized around 500, and this is the image we see behind us. It is a romanized image, of course, of this act of Clovis that is baptized in Reims.
Can't seem to say goodbye. Ooh, yeah. When I try to fall back, I fall back to you. Yeah. When I talk to my friends, I talk about you. Yeah. When the Hennessy's all I see.
How and when did the name of Brussels originate? The commonly accepted story is that it originates from medieval times, from the word Bruossela, meaning a castle in a swamp.
Or could it be but that it's much older, over 2,000 years old, from the Celtic wording Briva Uoxilla, meaning bridge by the hill? What do you think?
In the next episode, we'll be talking to Professor van Nieuwenhuizen. He's from the University of Amsterdam, and we will discuss the birth of the city of Brussels during the medieval times.
We hope you enjoyed episode 1, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.